just want to make you aware that Limmud Ottawa creative content and programming is mostly developed on unceded ancestral lands of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, and we recognize that the key to reconciliation is through mutual respect and encouraging opportunities for reciprocal community dialogue and learning, a process to which we remain fully committed. So we are in our last week of counting the Omer, and that will end next Sunday on Shavuot. And we are also at the end of celebrating Canada's Jewish Heritage Month. We want to thank you for joining us here today. So just a few announcements. Please keep in mind that your Zoom link provides you access to all the sessions in this series. And please put your questions in the chat. And depending on the time, we will do our best to get to them. So we thank you for being here and learning with us today. I'm going to hand this over to David Sachs, who will take it from here.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, for spending your Sunday afternoon with us. And before I introduce our speaker for this afternoon, I'd like to tell about her organization, which is Stand With Us. Stand With Us is an international and nonpartisan Israel education organization that inspires and educates people of all ages and backgrounds, challenges misinformation, and fights anti-Semitism. There is a Canadian chapter that I have been fortunate enough to observe their work, and this is a really important organization doing critical work, keeping students able to express themselves and understand such a complex and difficult issue. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Charlotte Korchak is the senior educator at Stand With Us. Charlotte graduated with a BA in Middle Eastern History from USC and has since been working for Stand With Us. In her current role, Charlotte works with over 10,000 students a year, educating them about Israel and training them to be activists in their high schools, universities, and communities worldwide. Today, Charlotte is going to be discussing concepts and misconceptions about Israel, Zionism, and the Jews, a topic that could not be more important right now, and I know something which we locally are finding to be a critical issue right now, and I'm sure is that way across the Western world. In this talk, we will discuss core concepts and misconceptions regarding Israel, Zionism, and the Jews, and provide the tools needed to explain these topics to others. Moreover, we will also tackle the claims made against Israel's right to exist, providing the necessary knowledge to challenge those arguments and show that these expressions of anti-Zionism are in fact rooted in anti-Semitism. And with that, I'd like to say thank you to our speaker today and give it to Charlotte to take away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate the introduction to me, to Stand With Us, to the talk, very helpful. So hi, everyone, good evening. A little bit more about me, just so you know where I'm coming from, and then we can dive in. First of all, I'm coming to you from Jerusalem on Jerusalem Day. I'm lucky I made it home, considering that I live right in the center of town where all the action was happening, but it's died down by now. But as you can tell from my lack of accent, I'm obviously not a native-born Israeli. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and I lived there until I was 9 in a very classic Jewish bubble. And then my parents decided to move to Israel. So we moved to a much bigger Jewish bubble across the world. And we spent 5 years living in Israel. And it was during those years that I will come face to face with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for the first time. I turned 13, and a month later, the second Intifada started. We all remember that time period of that big wave of terrorism that began in September of 2000 and went on for about 4.5 years. My adolescence, and again, my really real, raw, lived experiential way of being introduced to a conflict. And like was said, a very complicated conflict. And here I was with all my emotions entangled in all of it. And it got even worse when a suicide bomber walked up to a group of my friends who were out eating pizza on a Saturday night and blew himself up and murdered 3 of them. So my introduction to the conflict was very raw. And again, I didn't understand any of it. So I developed a lot of feelings and emotions without truly understanding what was going on around me. And then my family moved back to the States. We moved from Jerusalem to Las Vegas, which is a little weird, like the holy city to the city of sin. It was awkward. And I was in a different world all of a sudden. And Israel was kind of put behind. I mean, I just had to live my life. And I had some survivor's guilt. It wasn't easy. We didn't last long in Vegas, just a year. And then we moved to Maryland, where I finished up high school. And again, up until this point, I again had kind of put things aside. I had to live life and get into a good university and just go move on. But then I got into a good university, and I made my way out to that university in Los Angeles. And about 8 months into my freshman year, my first year, excuse me, I'm speaking to Canadians, my first year at USC, I came face to face with an apartheid wall. And so, you know, in my adolescence, I came face to face with the conflict. And then in my adult life, I came face to face with another conflict. It's a conflict that's taking place not in Israel, but around the world. And it's for Israel's legitimacy, right? It's this debate on whether or not Israel should exist, which let's start by just acknowledging how asinine of a conversation that is. The simple fact that there is a debate about the existence of this country in this day and age is mind-boggling. And I think for many, they would easily make the argument that simply because there is a conversation about Israel's right to exist, that is anti-Semitic, because it is the only Jewish country in the world, and yet it's the only country in the world whose legitimacy and existence is actually questioned. And so there's so much to unpack here. And so we don't have a lot of time. So the end of my story is that I became an activist, and very quickly, soon after that, I became an educator. And I started working for Stand With Us a year after I graduated. I've been with them now for 12 years. And I literally spend my days going around the world educating people about Israel, Zionism, the Jewish people, and anti-Semitism, and helping people understand what's actually going on here, help people understand what is the false narrative out there, and how can we combat the false narrative with real information, with facts, and most importantly, with our own stories as Jews or as Zionists. So let's start with really the core misconception that we have to tackle, because if there's a core false narrative that if people believe, then really nothing else you say about Israel is going to matter to them. Right? Somebody can challenge you on what happened in Gaza a year ago, and why did Israel bomb Gaza, and why did so many people die in the bombings of Gaza? And you could give this really, you know, really clear explanation about Hamas and how they fired rockets at us and how we were defending ourselves from that threat. And you can go on and give a very good answer, but the person will respond by saying, okay, but of course Hamas is firing rockets at you because you shouldn't be there to begin with. And you guys just need to leave because that's not your home. And you need to go back to where you came from, because that's the false narrative. So let's hammer this out, this false narrative, very quickly. What is it? It is that we Jews are white European colonialists who came to this land and stole it from the native population. Now, first of all, let's acknowledge that this false narrative is incredibly believable, right? I mean, here I'm speaking to Canadians, right? A bunch of white people from Europe came to a country and stole it from the natives. I mean, I'm an American, right? We all have some baggage in this conversation. And it's so incredibly believable because it's happened all over the world. That was the world for so long, was European colonization. And so here you have this incredibly believable narrative, right? And then we come forward and we're like, no, that's actually not true. But the story that I'm about to tell you is almost unbelievable, but it is the truth. And that's our first big challenge. And that's why you need to know the facts. You need to know the information so that you can back up this very unbelievable story with the truth. So let's start. White European colonialists. This is the primary way of really knocking the Jews down a peg, right? In this day and age, especially in the progressive world, being white is not a good thing. It's associated with privilege. It's associated with really a lack of any kind of discrimination against your community. And that's really what they're trying to do, is put the Jews in this position of power and really push aside the element of anti-Semitism. So we have to answer this question one at a time. Are Jews white? Well, you know, I look around this room and it would be very hard for me to look at somebody and say, no, Jews aren't white, or me, Charlotte, I'm not white. But here's what we need to be able to explain to people is Jews, some Jews, i.e. me, Charlotte, some of us have white skin. We do, we have white skin. Why do we have white skin? Because this part of the Jewish people ended up in Europe. But let's not forget the half of the Jewish population who had been exiled 600 years before the Jews were exiled to Europe, who were exiled to the Middle East. right? Over half the Jewish population today are people of color, or at least have one ancestor that is of the Mizrahi or Sephardi background. And so, no, Jews as a collective are not white. And you can talk about my Charlotte's individual experience of being a Jew who ended up in Europe and what it's like to have white skin. But there are many other Jews who are Black, who are Yemenite, who are Persian, who are Iraqi, who are not white and have never been white. And so essentially what I try to explain to people is, by calling the Jews as a collective white, what you're ultimately doing is erasing over half the Jewish population. And that's not what we want to be doing, right? Let's understand that Jews span the racial spectrum, and that's because Jews lived in exile for 2,000 years. And in those 2,000 years, we scattered throughout the world, and that changed our phenotypes as people were converted into being part of the Jewish people. And as a result, we developed different looks as a people. So that's number one. No, we're not white as a collective. We span the racial spectrum. And then the European part, right? Well, this confuses people. People hear Jews saying, well, I'm Russian, or I'm Polish, or I'm a German Jew. And so they think, oh, okay, so like Jews are a religion and like that's their nationality, German or Russian or Polish. When really what people need to understand is both Polish and Jewish would be a nationality. And really what Polish was for so many Jews wasn't their identity, it was their diasporic identity. It was the identity that they gained when they ended up in the diaspora. But the identity that links them back to their origins is the fact that they kept calling themselves Jews. So if I'm a Polish Jew, then yeah, I'm a Jew, linking me back to the land of Judea, but I live in Poland now. Why? Because I was exiled from my homeland. So yes, while some Jews ended up in Europe, let's go back to my previous point. Over half the Jewish population had never stepped foot in Europe. Again, they lived in the Middle East, they lived in North Africa. So that's the European part. And then the last part, the colonizer part. Wow. I mean, this should be offensive. It is offensive to me when people say this to me. I'm a Jew. This is my homeland. You're going to try to say that I'm a colonizer, which essentially is telling me that I am foreign to this land. And to me, as somebody who is deeply connected to this land, to me, you call me a colonizer and I feel very homeless. I feel of a lack of belonging to a place because this is my home. And so what we have to remind people of is, no, I'm not a colonizer. I'm not foreign to this land. I'm actually from this land, right? My language that that me personally as an Israeli that I speak every day, my culture, my traditions, they're Jewish and they come from the land of Judea. We're ultimately, as a people, we're indigenous to this land. Again, our traditions, our language, our culture, all stemming from this territory. The fact that we became a people in this land, the fact that we are intrinsically connected to this land, the fact that we have a spiritual connection to this land, and the fact that we've lived in this land continuously for 3,000 years, all verify and support the idea that the Jews are absolutely indigenous to this land. So no, I'm not a colonizer. This is my homeland. This is where I belong. And some people might say, well, no, you're Canadian. Look at you, right? And they might call you out. And sometimes we have to remind people of the really freakish traditions that some of us Jews do. Okay. Like they're like, yeah, you're Canadian. And then I'm like, okay. So like a month and a half ago, when I was walking around my house in the dark with a candle and a wooden spoon and a feather looking for crumbs and like sweeping them into a brown paper bag, and then the next day going out into the street and burning it, that's Canadian culture. And if none of you are laughing, like just think through how weird and cultish that tradition is. And it goes back to this land from 2,000 years ago. So yeah, I might have somewhat assimilated into Canadian or into American culture, but ultimately the practices that we practice on a yearly basis, on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, those all stem back to this territory, the land of Israel, where our home is. So no, I'm not white and I'm not European and I'm not a colonizer. I am part of a people who span the racial spectrum, who ended up all over the world as a result of exile. But our home, our origins, our indigenous land is the land of Israel, the land of Judea. And that's where we get our names. We're the Jews from Judea. So that's the first false narrative that really needs to be, again, pushed aside. And we need to reestablish for people that Jews are from this land. Now, here's the second part of this story, though, that's very important. One of our biggest challenges today is that you have people on the other side of this conflict who deny this to the Jews, right? They say, no, you're European, you're not from here. And they get reinforced by the world. You're colonizers. And when you're told by the world that these people that you're fighting against are colonizers, and you're told, like, don't worry, fight long enough, colonizers eventually leave. They eventually give up and they go home. Well, Palestinians are going to keep fighting. So there's a problem that they think that we're going to somehow go home one day. There's another issue, though, is that there are people on our side who do exactly the same thing. There are people on our side who delegitimize the Palestinians and the Arab and the Muslim connection to this territory. So the second part of the story, if I'm going to lay a foundation for somebody, correcting the false narrative and laying the proper narrative on the table upon which to understand the rest of this conflict, well, then I also have to establish that, you know, in the 7th century, Arab Muslims showed up to this land and they conquered it from the Christians and they laid down roots here. And from that moment on, this territory becomes important to Arabs and to Muslims, and it remains important to them until today. And so just like the Jews have a deep connection to this land, so do the Palestinians. And so once I can get to the point where both people agree on that foundation, that we've both been here for over 1,000 years, we both have legitimate claims to this land, we both have deep, deep connections to this land. And then the kicker of it all is neither one is really intending on going anywhere these days. So we have to figure out a way to solve this conflict with that in mind. And every day that there are people on either side denying those facts is pushing us further away from really being able to solve this conflict. So that's the proper foundation upon which we want to place all of the information that we talk about. Now, that's going to be the first claim that's used against Israel's right to exist. People say, well, you stole that land from the Palestinians. It's not yours. You're a colonizer, and therefore your state is illegitimate. And so the answer is no. I am from this land. I immigrated back to this land legally. I bought land legally, and tension and violence began. And by the end of it, there was a war, and that's how we ended up with territory. So it's a lot more complicated than what's being described, and it's worth a conversation. But the same way that the Arabs have rights and claims here, so do the Jews. That's claim number one. Now, claim number two starts pretty much right after and during the War of Independence and moving forward, which essentially I would group the claims into what I'm going to call modern day atrocities. We hear things like ethnic cleansing, we hear things like genocide, we hear things like apartheid. And very oftentimes, these are things that are used to delegitimize the state of Israel, to say that it's just a country that should not exist. So let's kind of go through those really quickly. Genocide. Genocide is, again, one of the more offensive claims. And the main reason that it's so offensive is because it's just so wildly untrue, and even more offensive because not only is it wildly untrue, but there's zero evidence to actually support this notion. There is no evidence that anyone of Israeli leadership has ever stated a willingness or a goal to wipe out all of the Palestinians. It's never happened. Meanwhile, somebody might say, okay, well, maybe they're smarter than Hitler and they're not going to say it out loud. Maybe. But then it would be demonstrated through action, right? And what do we know about a genocide? We know that if a genocide is happening against a specific population, that population's population is going to decrease steadily or rapidly, depending on how fast the genocide is going. The Palestinian Arab population from 1948 onwards has only increased. It went from 1.2 million in 1948 to over 12 million today in the world. There is no evidence to support, again, a genocide. You would not see a growing population. You would see a decreasing population. And what do we see when we look at casualties in the conflict? We see that there are these spurts, these moments of time where you see an uptick in casualties. And then again, the graph goes up, and then there's a steady decline or very short decline, and then it goes up again, and then a little decline, and then it goes up again. Those are operations, right? This is a conflict that every so often sparks into real violence that's taking place on like a day-to-day basis for a certain period of time. And in those windows, people are going to die. People die on the Palestinian side, people die on the Israeli side, more on the Palestinian side, and that's a conversation for another time. But the idea that that equals genocide is crazy. And so again, there's no evidence to support this. And those would be the pieces of evidence that I would give somebody to show them there's no evidence of systemic killing of an entire group of people in this conflict. You just don't see it. Ethnic cleansing, many would argue, is that step towards genocide, right? Well, maybe you guys didn't commit a genocide, but you definitely expelled as many Arabs as you could during the War of Independence. That's going to be the accusation, that there was a policy of expelling Arabs from our territory. Now, this couldn't be further from the truth. Many people try to argue, and I've heard this from Palestinians themselves, they very deeply believe that Zionism at its origins was about getting rid of the Arabs and ethnically cleansing them, and that there was a real policy and an effort to make that happen. Now, again, this couldn't be further from the truth. First of all, let's define Zionism. One of those concepts that so many people either don't understand or really, unfortunately, our anti-Zionists have really defined the word on our behalf, or I should say misdefined the word on our behalf. So what does it mean? Well, Zionism is the belief in and support for Jewish self-determination in the historic ancestral homeland of the Jewish people. So Zionism, modern Zionism, has two components. And if you're ever explaining this to somebody, it's very easy, two components: a Jewish state in the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people. That's it. So that's what Zionism was. So where's the ethnic cleansing? Well, people would say, well, it was a Jew-only country. That's what they were trying to build. And that's not true either. From Herzl, who wrote the book Alt-Neuland, which talked about Arabs and Jews living in this country together, to Jabotinsky in 1934, writing a constitution for the future Jewish state in which he talks about the Arabs being part of the country. And then, I mean, if you jump ahead to actually the founding of the state of Israel, by the end of the War of Independence, 160,000 Arabs actually remain inside of what becomes Israel. They're given citizenship in Israel. They vote in Israel's first election, and actually an Arab party, the Democratic List of Nazareth, who got 2 seats in the first election, they actually were part of Ben-Gurion's first ever coalition. So the notion that from the get-go Zionism was about a Jew-only country doesn't fit. It doesn't fit literally the actual words of the Zionist leaders of the time, and it doesn't fit the facts on the ground. Now, there's one thing to talk about. During the War of Independence, there were expulsions that took place. There's no denying that. There were Jewish militias that in certain circumstances absolutely expelled people. Now, what were those circumstances? Well, comes March of 1948, and Ben-Gurion is concerned. He's worried about the siege on Jerusalem that's taking place. He's worried that in a month and a half in March, the British are going to leave and the Arab countries might invade Israel. And yeah, he turns offensive, and he essentially says to his soldiers, go village to village. And if you encounter hostility, you need to clear out that village. This has been completely turned around today, where now what people argue is that Ben-Gurion actually said, not go village to village and clear out hostility, but he said, go village to village and clear out the Arabs, which doesn't make sense because there were Arab villages that weren't touched during the War of Independence. I mean, literally on the road to Jerusalem, I'm sure many of you have visited Jerusalem before. And as you're climbing up the mountains to Jerusalem, you drive through an Arab town. It's called Abu Ghosh, right? It sits right on the edge of Jerusalem, right before you climb the hill to Mevaseret Zion. Well, Abu Ghosh was there in 1948. And as the Jewish militias were going village to village along the road to Jerusalem, well, they encountered a lot of hostility, and they cleared out most of the villages along the road, but not Abu Ghosh. Why? They were Arabs. And if the policy was kick out all the Arabs, why would they not kick out Abu Ghosh? And the answer is very simple, because the policy wasn't to kick out Arabs. The policy was to expel hostility so that we could survive the war. And the Abu Ghoshniks, by the end of the war, are still there. They get citizenship, and they've been Israeli citizens ever since. So again, these ideas all go back to a broader notion, really trying to taint Zionism as this racist movement, which of course it's not. And in fact, I mean, I think I'm going to say this as a Jew, it had nothing to do with anybody else. Like the notion that our movement had something to do with you, or that we were building off of you, that we were going to do something to you, and that was part of our, no, this had nothing to do with you. Zionism was about the Jews. It was about Jews in Europe trying to figure out a way to get away from persecution. And the idea that the Palestinians think that they were even a forethought, let alone an afterthought, is ridiculous. And I know that might sound offensive to them. Yeah, sure, once we showed up to this land and we realized there were Arabs here, that was definitely part of the conversation. But at the inception of the movement in Russia or in Austria, yeah, they were really not taken into consideration. This was about Jewish reality at the time, and how we can get Jews into a better reality at that time. So no, there wasn't an ethnic cleansing. The last one is apartheid. Now, of course, I'm sure every one of you have heard this accusation. And it's gotten worse over the years, because not only has an Israeli human rights organization come out saying Israel's an apartheid, and that's the organization B'Tselem. Human Rights Watch followed suit about a year and a half ago. And of course, most recently, we have Amnesty International, who's joined this party, who put out their own report as well earlier this year. And then in addition to that, we also have the UN. The UN is going to be putting out a report in July stating the same thing. So why? Where's it coming from? Well, I have to tell you all something really ridiculous about the Amnesty International report. Amnesty International report starts with one line. It's a quote from Bibi Netanyahu. And actually, I'm going to just read it because I have it actually open on my computer, funny enough. And it starts with a quote of Bibi Netanyahu saying, let me just find it very quickly. Here. He says, according to the nation state law that we passed, Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people and them alone. And that's where the quote ends. Again, I'll repeat that. It says, according to the nation state law that we passed, Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people and them alone. And that's where the quote ends by Amnesty International. And the craziest part is that there's a second half to this quote that they just decided to leave out. And the second half of the quote goes, as you wrote, there's no problem with the Arab citizens of Israel. They have the same rights as us all, and the Likud government has invested in the Arab sector more than any other government. And Amnesty decided to take this quote, chop off the second half, which obviously negates the entire rest of the report that says that Israel's an apartheid country. So the distortion, the deception that's used in these reports to make these claims is actually honestly shocking even to me. And I've been doing this work for 15 years. So let's really understand why it's so shocking. Well, Israel, and when I talk about Israel, let's be clear, there's Israel proper, and then there's disputed territories. When we talk about Israel proper, we're not talking about the West Bank, we're not talking about Gaza. In Israel proper is a democracy. It was born a democracy. We read out a Declaration of Independence on May 14th, 1948, that said that this country would be a Jewish state. Yes, it said that, meaning a home for the Jewish people, meaning a safe haven for the Jewish people. And what did that mean to our founders? A majority Jewish country. But in that same document, they said that every citizen of the state of Israel would have equal rights no matter their race, their religion, or their gender. And so from the get-go, this is going to be a Jewish state and a democratic state. Now, granted, every one of us who's ever been to Israel or ever follows what's going on in Israel knows that we've never lived up to this. People don't actually feel that way in Israel. We have so many hurdles to overcome. But the law says that everyone's equal. And what does that mean? That means, yeah, of course, people might suffer racism. Of course, people might experience discrimination. But there is a legal avenue within which to fight against that discrimination. That's a democracy. It's not that it's perfect. It's not that it's a utopia. It's not that everyone treats everyone equally and everyone feels that way. No. But that if you feel discriminated against, if you are discriminated against, that there is a legitimate way in which you can fight against that discrimination, be it voting for representatives who will represent you and fight for your rights in the government, be it going out into the street and protesting, or hell, if it's somebody who's directly discriminating against you, you can sue them because, again, it's against the law. And literally every single thing that I just said is the exact opposite of what you would have in an apartheid country. If somebody who was considered the second class in an apartheid country was discriminated against, they had no legal avenue within which to fight against it because it was legal. And so the notion that you can call Israel an apartheid is just so frustrating. And I hope you can hear it in my voice because it's so hard to talk about it without frustration. Because you're just sitting there and just how? And as an American, I have to tell you, this bothers me even more. Because even I would even argue that the American government could be more accused of this than Israel could. And it would be wrong in both contexts. Why? Because there was something called apartheid. And it was horrific to Black people in South Africa. And the last thing that we should be doing is throwing this word around where we diminish it. And we diminish what it means and what it means to the Black people who suffered under this horrific regime. And so the last thing we should be doing is, again, minimizing this word or playing fast and loose with a word that has such deep and such an important meaning to people who genuinely suffered as a result of this horrific notion. There's more to talk about, but I'm going to run out of time. So we're going to jump on to the one final thing. And the second part of the apartheid thing would be apartheid in the West Bank. which there's also not, but we don't have time to dive into it. If people have questions, feel free to ask. The last one I would argue is the most important. Who are we? Who are we as Jews? You know, I've taught for 10 years, and I've taught Jews and non-Jews. And I started to come across this problem where Jews, I would get to a point where I would say to somebody, so Jews are a people. And then they'd be like, wait, what? What does that mean? And I found myself a Jew, raised Jewish my whole life, observant every holiday, every tradition. And I could not explain who we were. We use a lot of words. Jews are a civilization, and they're an ethnicity, and they're a religion, and they're a culture, and they're all these things. And we need one thing, because we confuse people. And it makes sense that we confuse people. You know why? Because we're trying to put Jews into a box, and we don't fit into any box. You know why? Because we predate all the boxes. So what are we? Well, the way that I think it's the easiest to explain what Jews are is to explain that Jews are a people. Why are Jews not a religion? Because we don't all believe in the same creed. Find me 5 Jews who all believe in the same thing, and I'll give you $10. Okay? Because we just don't. You don't have to believe in God to be a Jew. You don't have to believe in any of Judaism. You have to be born Jewish, or you have to convert to be a Jew. I'm the daughter of 2 converts, so that's really personal to me. So we're not a religion. Ethnicity, yes, maybe, but not really. Yeah, we have some genetic binding markers. Yes, sort of some cultural connection, definitely, but it's still too small of a box. We're definitely not a race. That was just the crazy Nazis, and we're not even going to entertain that. Jews are a people. Now, what makes us a people? In the 3 minutes that I have left, here we go. There are 4 things that we share. First of all, Jews share a history. And it doesn't matter where you were in the world. You know, somebody might say, they could look at, you know, a Yemenite Jew and be like, so you're trying to tell me the Holocaust was part of your story when you were in Yemen? And what would a Yemenite Jew say? They would say, what do you mean? Of course it was. Those are my family members that you murdered. I might never have met them, but here I was practicing the exact same culture that they were practicing in Poland or in Germany. So yeah, that is part of my story. We share a history. No matter where it happened, anywhere in the world, if it happened to Jews, it happened to us, because we are a family. So we share a history. And there was a time, by the way, where we shared a history entirely, where we were all together in the same places and we suffered the same things, but that was rare because we ended up in exile very early on in our tradition. The next thing we share is a culture. And I just hinted at it, right? We definitely share a culture. There's a binding line for sure that links the Jewish people. That being said, it's very easy to argue with this because we have different cultures. I mean, to a certain extent, you know, if I go to the Yemenite synagogue on Friday night, I'm gonna be really lost. Let me tell you guys, like I will have no idea what's going on. They're gonna be singing some stuff. I don't know what's going on, but there will be a point that I will catch up. Maybe that's the point when everyone puts their hands over their eyes and we all say a prayer that every single one of us knows out loud. Maybe it's that moment when every one of us takes 3 steps back and 3 steps forward and we all go quiet for a little while. But at some point you'll figure it out. At a Passover Seder, we might, you know, at some point my dad's going to give you a chunk of horseradish and you're going to hate your life. And then you might go to somebody else's house and at some point they're going to start whipping you with scallions and you're also going to hate your life. But it'll be a lot of fun. We have differences. Why do we have differences? Because we lived in exile. And so, yeah, the European Jews like dug horseradish up from under the ground and that's what they were able to eat. Whereas like people in Yemen could eat lettuce. It was nice for them. So yeah, we have different traditions, but ultimately we follow the same order. We follow the same yearly calendar. We have the same holidays and we have the same things that we commemorate. And then something crazy happened. Can I just throw this out there? Comes Israel. So for the longest time, Jewish tradition, Jewish culture was religious tradition, but then we came home. And now I can go anywhere in the world and I can ask a Jew, have you ever heard the song Yerushalayim Shel Zahav? And every one of us can start to sing it in our head. That's Jewish culture. And it's not religious, it's poetry. Or I could ask young kids today, have you ever heard or listened to Omer Adam? And every one of them will get a smile on their face. And they will start to sing his music in their head. And that's Israeli, that's Jewish pop culture. So we came home and our culture started to spread well beyond religion. So we share a culture. The next thing we share is a language that not all of us speak. And of course we don't all speak it. We spent 2,000 years living in exile. So we speak English and French and Farsi. But then we came home. And again, we came home and we started to realize that we needed a language for this home. And our language that we spoke, that was ours, had died as a colloquial language. And we put it all back together. And we made it a modern language again. This miracle, this never happened before. A dead language, essentially, now, 100 years later, spoken by at least 9 million people in this world, and the only place it was ever spoken before. And the last thing that we share is we share a land. It's what makes us a people, and not just a religion and not just those other things. We share a land, we share one home. And we say in Hebrew, we don't have another land. This is home. And you know what? A lot of people tend to say this land belongs to us. Well, I don't like it because you know what? I live alongside another people and they also belong here. So instead of the land belongs to us, how about this? We belong to the land. We've always belonged to this land. And so to sum it all up, yeah, we have to explain to people who we are. We have to explain to people our connection. We have to explain to people our culture. And when you start to lay those foundations and you get somebody to the point where they understand why a Jewish state and why here. And the last part is the why a Jewish state. And I hate to give this answer, but this is the answer. A Jewish state so that Jews can be safe and free in this world. That's the idea. Everything else is a consolation prize. Fauda and Omer Adam and all of the pop culture and Tel Aviv beaches, it's all a consolation prize so that I can be alive and that every one of us can sit in this world with a deep comfort inside of ourselves, knowing that if God forbid anything happens, there is at least one country out there who will have our backs. And that is something that I think every Jew deep down understands. And it's something that I think every non-Jew does not comprehend unless we explain it to them. So instead of getting angry when you hear accusations against Israel, instead of getting frustrated and thinking that everyone hates us, take a deep breath and realize that the vast majority of the time, they just don't understand us. And it's up to us to teach them because nobody else is going to. So don't get frustrated. Put on your educator hat and start to just teach them your traditions. Tell them your story. Tell them how it all links back for you because we're part of that chain. We're part of a long, long chain of traditions that ultimately links us back to our home. And that's why Zionism in the modern times, and that's why a Jewish state today. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Charlotte, for that. That was incredible. I really appreciate the passion and energy and excitement you bring to a topic that you've obviously discussed so many thousands of times. You may not have the accent of an Israeli, but you certainly have the hand gestures of a kind that are only native to, I think, Israel, Italy, and maybe parts of Long Island. So that was wonderful. I have so many questions about the work of your organization, of course, but we don't have time, so I'm going to stick with the really theme of your talk and ask about some of these concepts and conceptions. First, I want to ask you, you were discussing the apartheid slur and discussed it very eloquently in the manner as affecting the Israel state. So I want to put a couple of more tricky twists on this that people encounter all the time, which is, what about the West Bank? So that would be the first one. And the second one is, how do you simply counter the argument from authority without getting into the arguments themselves, the argument from authority of, oh, so UN Human Rights Council and B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch and Apartheid International, they're all wrong. Yeah. So can you give us a little bit on apartheid in relation to those two concepts?
Yeah. So first of all, let's just take the second one first. Look, NGOs have something called the halo effect. Because they're human rights organizations, it's as if they can do no wrong. They're angels coming to just do God's work in this world. And therefore they can't have a bias. They can't ever be wrong. They're infallible, which is a problem because they're not. They are actually incredibly biased. The simple fact that human rights is in their name says that their bias is human rights. But the bigger issue is that their bias is not just human rights. It's human rights, but it's human rights for who they perceive to be the victim. It's not human rights for everybody. And what happens when it comes to apartheid in Israel is these organizations helicopter into a conflict, and specifically in the West Bank. But what they do is they group all of the people, all of the Arabs between the river and the sea, those in the West Bank, those in Israel, and those in Gaza, they group them all together and they call them Palestinians. And then they say this whole group is discriminated against. Well, you can't talk about this group as one group because some of them are Israeli Arabs who have Israeli citizenship. Some of them are living under the Hamas regime in Gaza, and the rest are living partially under Fatah in the West Bank and partially under Israel. So first of all, there's this oversimplification that occurs in these reports that just completely diminishes what they're trying to say because their core your definitions from the get-go are false. And that's wildly problematic. So you've got the halo effect, you've got the fact that they're biased, and you've got the fact that they ignore a significant context that if you ignore, the reality in the West Bank looks like apartheid. So let's just understand that quickly, because that was the first question. Look, when people look at the West Bank, they see two different legal systems, they see two different sets of rights, and they think this is apartheid, right? It's one territory, and people have different rights, and people have different legal systems that they're under. That sounds like apartheid. Once you take a giant step back and you realize that there's actually two authorities in the West Bank that are giving out these laws. You've got the Israeli Authority and you've got the Palestinian Authority. And so, yes, there's inequality because some people are getting rights from the Israeli government, which are way more rights than the Palestinians get from the Palestinian Authority. And Palestinians are under the Palestinian legal system and Israelis are under an Israeli legal system. And so many people look at the West Bank and they think this is a territory under occupation, meaning there's one governing body and that governing body is treating people unequally within that territory. But it's not. It's just way more complicated than that, because there was this agreement made in the 1990s that broke down who's going to have jurisdiction in which part of the West Bank and how is this going to be governed this way. If that agreement didn't exist, if Israel forced this situation upon the Palestinians way back in the day, one might argue, yeah, this was apartheid. But this was agreed upon. The separation was agreed upon because the Palestinians were demanding it. They were demanding separation so they could have their own self-government. So no, the West Bank is not apartheid either. In fact, again, it has nothing to do with apartheid. It's just a really complicated middle of a conflict, and people helicopter into the middle of the conflict. They ignore the past and they look at today. And this is what happened in the Amnesty International report. Do you know how many times the word terror appears in the Amnesty International report? Once. In an 181-page report about what's going on in the West Bank and Israel, and terrorism appears once. I don't feel like my human rights are being talked about if you don't talk about terror more than once. I feel like one side's human rights are being talked about, and that's the Palestinians, because you perceive them as the victim. And if you ignore the context of terror, then everything Israel does is wrong. Of course it is. If we're not defending ourselves, then why do we have military in the West Bank? Why do we do operations every single day to arrest terrorists, to get rid of guns, to make sure that terror cells aren't planning terrorist attacks? And if you remove terror and everything that I just said from the equation, then it looks like we're just oppressing a people. And so if I'm a human rights worker and I helicopter in to the middle of a Palestinian town and I watch Israel doing arrests, and I remove the context of terror, I think, well, this is just brutal occupation and oppression, and it's clearly an apartheid-like policy against this oppressed people. So context matters, and it's wildly ignored today, especially the context of terror. And the problem is, especially with the younger generation, is what they don't see doesn't exist. And we prevent a lot more terrorist attacks than are successful. And even when they are successful, like in the last 6 weeks where 19 Israelis were murdered, nobody hears about it. So here we are.
Thank you for that. And I think that you brought up a really important point, which is that so much of the narrative about Israel is done simply by completely excluding and ignoring the actions on the side of the Arabs, so that all that is seen and all that is professed is Israeli offensives or Israeli regulations without any of the context to make it seem like, well, there's actually maybe there's a reason why that's going on.
Yeah.
Sticking with the West Bank, we have a question from our audience, from David Brooks. Why do you think it's important, or do you think it's important for the West Bank to remain under Israeli control?
So I think there's a lot of perspectives on this. I think, well, there's a few perspectives. One would be we have to stay in the West Bank now. And the reason, and I say now, not forever. This would be the middle. The middle would be, we need to be there now. We need to be there while there's still terrorism and there's still violence and there's still terror cells functioning in this area. If we pull out, we're going to have a second Gaza. That's what people think. They think if we pull out, Hamas is going to take over, and it's not going to bring about peace. It's going to bring about just a way worse reality for Israelis, but more importantly for the Palestinians in the West Bank. So that's the middle. Then you've got the far right that would say we should just apply our sovereignty there and never leave. And there's a whole host of issues with what you're going to do with the Palestinians, but that's, again, too complicated for the short answer that I have to give you right now. And then you have the other side that says, military commanders who say, listen, we should just withdraw, wash our hands of this, and whatever comes, we'll deal with. We know how to deal with threats, and we'll just deal with the next threat. But better that we withdraw now rather than continue to allow the occupation, our presence there, to continue to erode our morality. So those are the kind of the three angles that you see from the majority, I would say, of Israelis today, is either apply our sovereignty and just be done with it, pull out and just be done with it, or for right now, we need to be there. Let's maintain the status quo until we don't need to be there, until we can figure out a final agreement that will create an end to this conflict.
Are you going to be able to give us your own private view of that, or would that go against your nonpartisan?
Sure, I'm taking off my Stand With Us hat, which is very important. I want to stress this. When I educate, I don't share my opinion with students. I think it's very important for it to be kind of giving them as much information and letting them decide for themselves. Me personally, I'm a status quoer. I lived through the second Intifada. I think Israel needs its security. And I think pulling out of the West Bank would be so incredibly detrimental to our security. But more importantly, again, I think it would be so damaging to the Palestinians in the West Bank. If they have to live the way that people in Gaza live today under the Hamas regime, their lives are going to get so much worse, and they'll become even more radicalized, not because they want to, but just because there's no other option. And so it really scares me that the West Bank will become another Gaza. And so I'm very sternly a status quoer. But I firmly believe that the end of this conflict has to result in some type of self-determination for the Palestinians, because I believe in self-determination for the Jews, and I don't believe in denying it to another people. So those are my very basic opinions on this.
I'm going to ask a bit of a meta question from the audience again. This is from Merle Hatrick Matt. At which level is the best to have these conversations, these arguments that you're giving us to use? Political, grassroots, in the schools, religious groups?
I would say everywhere and anywhere where these conversations happen, because there's just so much misinformation out there. The important thing is, when you are meeting with a group, meet them at their level, right? Sometimes, we have people who are really into Israel, and they start a conversation with somebody, and the person doesn't know that 2 + 2 = 4. And you're diving into trigonometry, and they're like, wait, pump the brakes. Where's Israel on the map? And so we have to speak to people at their level. Can't go over their heads. You can't dive into criticism without laying the foundation. So we should be having these conversations everywhere. And it shouldn't start from a defense. It should not start from a defensive place. It should start from a place of, this is who we are. This is who the Jewish people are. This is our story, right? And sum up our story very quickly. And people look at me like I'm crazy when I say that, because how do you sum up 3,000 years of history quickly? But you have to, because we live in an attention span generation that is 10 seconds. So how do you do it? Sum it up in 4 parts. It's very easy. The Jews are indigenous to the land of Israel. The Jews were forced into exile. The Jews suffered persecution all through exile, relentlessly and endlessly, prompting us to finally seek liberation back in our homeland. Those are the 4 points. Get those 4 points across. Lay the foundation for somebody. Help them then understand Zionism, and build up as you go. And then they might get curious and ask you more questions. Great, but start at their level. And if we're going down, if there are parents, grandparents in the room, start with your kids, start with your grandkids, go young, help instill in them just who we are as Jews and what does Israel mean to us. Because that first step is, what does Israel mean to us? Why should I care? Why should I be a kid at a high school in Canada and care about this country that's 4,000 miles away? Why? And it's instilling that in such a young age, to the point that then when they are in high school, we can start to have the more complicated conversations. You can move up to, from basic arithmetic through algebra, through geometry, and maybe, you do get to calculus when they're still in high school, to really prepare them for the even more complicated conversations they might have later on in life. So for me, it's not the arguments. It's coming at it from a proactive place of not saying this is who we're not, right? They're saying this is what we are, and this is what we are, and they're wrong, and this is what we actually are. No, just this is who we are. And let's not come from a place of responsiveness or defensiveness, but come from a place of being proactive and wanting to go out there and share. So it's appropriate everywhere. Just remember who your audience is. And whenever you know who your audience is, then you have to ask yourself, based on the audience, what's the goal? What level am I at? And what's the goal of this conversation? Because it's going to be different depending on the audience. Oh, you're muted.
Thank
still.
you.
There.
And I wanted to get back to another topic that you touched on briefly, which is another one of the really sticky and difficult accusations or arguments that come up, and that is the demographic argument and maintaining a Jewish majority. And that is often presented, of course, as a kind of a proactive ethnic cleansing of inviting Jews back in while not allowing the right of return, or various other ways that it's presented. Can you talk a little bit about explaining how to overcome that when most people in the West are ingrained to think that a citizen is a citizen and we should bring all people in equally?
Yeah, so first of all, it's always going to go back to, again, why a Jewish state, right? I mean, if you don't understand the need for a Jewish state in the world, then you're not going to understand anything else that I'm about to say, right? And again, that need goes back to explaining to people very honestly and very candidly sometimes that the reason we need a Jewish country has nothing to do with us and has everything to do with how everybody else treated us. And the reality is that for 2,000 years, we were a people without a country, and that meant that we were a defenseless people. And not just a defenseless people, but we were an endlessly persecuted defenseless people. And so after 1,800 years of that endless persecution, the reason we decided that we had to have a country was because the world proved to us that they wouldn't protect us. And again, we came to this conclusion before the Holocaust. The Holocaust just proved it to us, right? When really everyone abandoned us. I mean, even Canada, sent the St. Louis, sailing away. So the fundamental is explaining that, and then going on to explain, so a Jewish state was established, and like any other sovereign nation in this world, they have the right to decide who is eligible for citizenship and who is not. And essentially the law is that if you are Jewish, if you have one Jewish grandparent, you can come and be eligible for citizenship. You can come and make aliyah, and all you need is one Jewish grandparent to do so. The only other way to become a citizen is to marry an Israeli or marry a Jew and move to Israel. Now, yes, for some Canadians, especially Americans, that sounds really harsh. What about everyone else? Aren't you a democracy? Isn't that a little racist? No, it's not racist. What it is it's exclusionary. And the thing is we're not being exclusionary because we hate everybody else. Actually, just the opposite. We're being exclusionary because of all the people who have hated us. And we're just trying to protect ourselves. And that's something that just the average person does not understand. They look around and they see the Jews in Toronto and Thornhill, and they see the Jews in Montreal living on those hilltops, and they're like, the Jews are doing just fine. And they don't see the anti-Semitism as a result. And they don't understand Jewish history, and they don't understand the fears of the Jewish people. And they think, okay, well, there was a Holocaust and that was really bad. That was like one 15-year period. Like, you guys are fine. And it's like, but no, the Holocaust wasn't the only part of our persecution. It was just the worst of our persecution, but it's always been. And so again, it goes back to explaining that, yeah, it's exclusionary, but it has nothing to do with racism. It has to do with protection. And if you're truly, I would say this to somebody, if you're truly against, if you're truly for bolstering and protecting marginalized communities in this world, then you should be a Zionist. And you would be supportive of those laws. Yeah, sure. In an ideal world, would we be able to open up our borders and let anyone in? No, by the way, and no country would ever do that. But if we could, we still wouldn't. And it's not because we don't like people. It's because we need to be safe. And again, I hate saying it. I hate that that's the crux of Zionism. But again, nothing else matters if we're not alive. So we need to have a law of return. Why can't Palestinians return? Well, because it would mess up the demographics, but more importantly, and I think this is really important to emphasize, when the people became refugees, when the Palestinian Arabs became refugees in 1948, it was as a result of a war that their own leadership started. And they became refugees, and Israel even said after that war, well, they can return as long as these Arab countries make peace with us. And then everyone rejected not only making peace with us, but recognizing our existence and the expectation that after you don't make peace with us, and reject our existence, that we then are going to allow 700,000 Arabs back into the country, where they could be a fifth column from within, where they can try to sabotage the country from within, which, by the way, the head of the Arab League actually told us they would do. The notion that we could allow those people back into the country, not knowing who would be hostile and who would be loyal, was just not something. We couldn't play fast and loose with our viability in 1949 of all times. And nowadays, the notion that these 5.7 million are not just equally as hostile or even more hostile towards the Jewish state after living in refugee camps for 7 years is just an asinine notion. So what should happen? Well, we made 2 offers in the last 22 years that said that Palestinians could have a state in the West Bank and Gaza, and we would give them $30 billion to resettle their refugees in that state. So no, you can't go back to Jaffa, you can't go back to Akko, you can't go back to Haifa, but you can go back to the West Bank or Gaza, live in your own country, and live a better life than probably what you're living in a refugee camp today. But that's never been acceptable to the Palestinians because the right of return to Israel proper is such an ethos. And we're going to say, listen, it's our sovereign right. And the hope is that you could go to your own country and you could have your own country, but it's never been accepted. So it's a little more complicated, but all of those layers need to be explained for people to understand our very strict immigration laws.
Thank you for that. And I think it's quite ironic that so many people who would argue for safe spaces in minorities in universities would deny a safe space to a minority which has had genocide attempted against it multiple times over multiple centuries in multiple countries. But here we are. I'm going to ask you one final question before we wrap up, and that is if you can tell us a story or stories from Stand With Us to give us some hope, because we hear so many terrible stories and sometimes it seems like the trend, especially on campuses and with students, is never ending downward trend. So tell us something the opposite, please.
I'll tell you one from the University of Ottawa. Stand With Us has an amazing program that we bring to Canada every year. It's called Word Swap. We bring 8 Israelis to campus and we go campus to campus. And I mean, we drive from Montreal down to Kingston, up to Ottawa, down back to Toronto, down to London. I mean, we're going everywhere. And we set up a table and we just put out coffee. We don't have an Israeli flag. We're not trying to cause a scene. We just want to have conversations with people. We put out coffee, and we have the Israelis, and we bring fortune cookies that have facts about Israel inside of them. And we just literally send the Israelis out to go and schmooze. And they go up to people, you want a cup of coffee? And I'll never forget, it was either University of Ottawa or Carleton, but it was definitely in Ottawa. And I was talking to a guy, and it was a day where Israel, it was right around the time that Israel had bombed a building in Gaza. And it was something happened, there was misinformation, and 10 innocent people died. And I was talking to a guy, and on the way, me and the Israelis were sitting in the car, hearing this report, and we were reeling from it. We were expressing such empathy and just frustration that this happens, that for our defense, sometimes innocent people die, and how frustrating and hard that is to swallow and to process. And I show up on campus, and a guy is arguing with a couple of my soldiers, and we go up, we start to have a conversation. And he said, you guys are the terrorists, we're the terrorists. There was a back and forth. And then I expressed to him what I just expressed to you. I said, listen, we are a group of Israelis. There's 9 of us here, right? And literally on the drive over, we were talking about how upset we were about this story and how the last thing that we want is innocent people to die in this conflict, especially for our defense, and how we look for ways to figure out how to minimize this and how to make this not a reality. And the guy looked at me and he said, I have to tell you something. I have never heard an Israeli, a Zionist, express any kind of compassion for the Palestinians. I have never heard that you guys actually care. And so I might still not stand alongside you, but I really appreciate what you said. I didn't win him over, but I showed him a side of Israel he had never seen before. And you're not going to win somebody over in a second. You're just not. It's not one conversation, but it's planting seeds. It's planting seeds that show people that usually what they're tuned into is the minority and the extreme minority. And what they need to be in tune with is the very quiet majority of Israelis and Palestinians who are just trying to live their lives. And y'all, that was one of countless conversations that we had at places like McGill and Concordia and Queens and York University And everywhere else where we had people come up to us who started out really hateful, and by the end thanked us for not having an Israeli flag. Why? Because they said, if you had one, I would have turned the other direction. But instead I stopped and I started this conversation, and you guys hit something. You just made me realize that there was a lot I didn't know. And so even on some of the most extreme campuses that we think are the worst, and students just suffer on these campuses every day, there are so many people who might in a mob seem very anti, pull them aside one-on-one, and they become human again. And then you become human in their eyes, and everything can change. So there's so much positive. It's just how you do it. And it's not being in people's faces, and it's not being aggressive. It's coming in under the radar, and it's just exposing them to a different side of Israel that they've never seen before. And every one of us can do that every day if we make it a part of our lives. And that's what Stand With Us does. We're there to help every step of the way. We have an office there in Canada. It's based in Toronto. We have somebody in Montreal. So if anyone wants to get more involved, I put my email in the chat. You could always reach out. If your question didn't get answered, please reach out. I loved that final question. You reminded me of all my stories, and I hope to be coming back on WordSpot in November of this year. And if anyone wants to help support or get more involved, let us know, and we'd be happy to make that happen. We'll definitely be coming through Ottawa again. So we'll definitely be in touch. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I really appreciate this.
Thank you.
David, I wanted to say thank you to both you and to Charlotte. An extraordinary work in extraordinary times. And it's always good to hear that to bring people over, to have a solidarity with the information that you give is much better than isolation, than causing people to run away. This is a very important message that you bring, and we wish you all the luck. And we hope to see you again very soon. And what can I say? This discussion will continue at another time, of course. And I just wish David a lot of luck with your new position now with the JFO. And you'll be getting around quite a bit, I'm sure, and putting out the word. And you know, there are many fights, there are many battles that we still have to go through on the side of anti-Semitism, and of course the narrative of Israel, and of the hope of bringing unification of peace. That's basically what you do. So I'm also going to say thank you to all our participants coming here, watching a screen on a most beautiful day. And we do have another session coming up at 3:30, something very exciting, something very different. And this is Rethinking Social Justice with Rabbi Yonah Lavery Disraeli from Hamilton. So that will be very interesting as well. We also wanted to push, we always push grassroots organizations in our hometown. And I just wanted to let your attention, put your attention to the 10 Yad of Ottawa. This is a grassroots organization that is dedicated to undertaking acts of chesed and run entirely by and through volunteers. They do enormous work. They go with and they provide kosher pantries in all the different hospitals in Ottawa. And they come up with emergency meals for those who cannot cook at home. So pay attention to it, reach out to them, and we make our community a little bit more better as well. So thank you. Again, the link will work for all the series, for every session we are bringing, and we hope to see you back at 3:30. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Oh, yes. If people want to stay on, they can stay on as well until we start our next session, but it's at 3:30.